Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all having a great conference and you had a great lunch. My name is David Barrow. I'm a member of the BCS ITSM and ITAM committee, but it's not me you're here to see, because it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Tim Payne, who's going to be speaking to us all about DevEx and how to share and enjoy the DevOps experience. So over to you, Tim.
Okay, thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying today so far. My name's Tim Payne. I tend to leave the doctor out because it tends to be a bit funny when you start talking about Dr. Payne. It's almost like Dr. Evil. So I've been a IT consultant and architect for the last 25 years or so. And since about 2009, I've been focusing primarily in the DevOps and DevEx area. My background is primarily in sort of consulting, business process engineering, SCM, CM, configuration management, and development. And for the last couple of years, I've been focusing primarily on DevEx and how to implement DevEx in sort of large-scale organizations. So if you're interested in linking to me, my sort of LinkedIn profile is at the top. Happy to connect and chat about any topics of any interest. You might not find the answers that you want, but at least I'm happy to talk about it. And today I'm going to be talking about DevEx, how to share and enjoy the DevOps experience. And yes, it does come from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Okay, so for the agenda for today's meeting, first we'll be covering a bit about what and why of DevEx. So, what is it and why do you do it? Then we'll talk a bit about DevEx versus DevOps. Are they different? Are they the same? Then we'll talk about a couple of different approaches for implementing DevEx. Then we'll talk about some implementation use cases that I've done in the last couple of years. There's a couple of models there that you can sort of use in fairly large-scale organizations, and they work fairly well. They are fairly portable. So if you're looking to implement DevEx or some of the ideas of DevEx within your organization, that's probably a good section to listen to. And then finally, we'll finish off by some takeaways and a Q&A session. Now, depending upon time, I may stop halfway through to take some questions, or I may push it all right to the end. So I'll sort of take it in about 20 minutes and see where we are with time. Just a little warning that I put on all these types of presentations. You have to remember DevOps, DevEx, they are all very context specific. So the mileage that you gain from this session may vary. I'm trying to make this as generic as possible, but when you actually start to implement these in your own organizations or in a client organization, you might find that what I talk about might not be relevant, or it might be relevant. So just be aware it is context specific. Okay, with that being said, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is a little bit about what is DevEx. Well, DevEx is another one of those wonderful buzzwords, as if the IT community doesn't have enough of them, but it's a buzzword that started to circulate probably about 2 or 3 years ago, primarily in the development and the DevOps community, although it has started to now sort of circumnavigate up to like testing communities, production communities, and also at the cultural level as well. So it is a word which is now becoming a lot more visible than it was, say, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So simply put, DevOps or DevEx, sorry, is all about developer experience. And it's mostly, and I use mostly in double quotes, about providing automation frameworks, pipelines, and environments in a shareable way with the goal of making things simpler for developers and testers to deliver. Now, I put it in double quotes because as it's a fairly young buzzword, there's still a lot of sort of going toing and froing between various experts in the sort of community about what DevEx actually is and what it encompasses. But when you're talking about DevEx in terms of DevOps, which is where it's mostly sort of being kicked up around at the moment, it's all to do with automation, pipelines, environments, helping things with developers and testers. So that's the areas I'm going to focus on for this presentation. So a simple DevOps model might look something like this. Sorry, DevEx model. might look something like this. You have a set of enterprise level DevEx services, which might be split into sort of like a library of test services. It might be split into a library of DevOps services, and it might be split into a library of environmental services. And basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to create libraries of reusable services that projects can use and contribute to at will. And the idea of doing that is to allow your developers and your testers to do quick implementations of DevOps and test automation without having to start from scratch. You're looking to try and optimize the internal dev and the SRE, which stands for Site Reliability Engineering Processes. You're trying to simplify code bases by basically creating templates and modules and libraries of these services that people can just pick up and use. You're trying to build tooling and other methods that can reduce the pain of the developer or the pain of the debugger, sorry, the pain of the tester when it comes to basically trying to debug applications that run over multiple environments, that might have multiple microservices involved, that might involve external services or internal services, hybrid services. You're trying to provide ways of basically trying to make life easier for the developer and the tester when they come to sort of trying to work out what's going on in those environments, what problems might be. And it's all about giving the developers and testers that mythical time back that never seems to happen, and the freedom to basically experiment, refactor, and do that lovely tech debt, which no one ever has time to do. But hopefully by using sort of DevEx approaches, where you've actually got these things already sort of set up to run, you can give developers and testers time back so they don't, because they don't need to do all this implementation from scratch again. So it's all about having things that you can share and sort of only use once, but allow people to make use of what's already being done. So that's really what DevEx at a high level is all about. So as I said, primarily DevEx is about two things. One is enhancing the development culture. That's either doing things like psychological safety, or it's things like trying to make the amount of work that they do a lot easier. And it's about reusing other people's work. And you could do these sort of things by creating libraries of common DevEx services that projects or teams can reuse and contribute. So that's why we're talking about service catalogs and libraries. When you create your services, you're looking to templaterize them as much as possible so that they can be shared for reuse, and they can be basically put into a version control repository, and you can just version them. You're allowing the project teams to basically use those services as like bricks or foundation layers for creating their own self-service dashboards or their own orchestrations, so that they can build their own business logic and their own visibility and transparency on top of those services. But they're basically just reusing the services. They don't need to do that development themselves. All they're developing is just the business logic on top of those services. You're looking to optimize the processes that are used to deliver and develop your software, especially in the testing side. And ultimately, you're looking to put in mechanisms so that you can empower your developers and testers within your organization to own the delivery process more, and basically identify things that make their lives easier, so that they can then sort of take those and deliver them and make other lives easier for other people within their organization as well. But so why do we actually do it? So we've talked a bit about what DevEx is, but why do we actually do it? Well, I always put it down to three main things. The weighting of these may be dependent on the organization or the sort of section, the sector that you're working in. But the first one that's always very generic is speed. Any service that's developed that can be reused saves a lot of the rest of the organization reinventing the wheel. If you're looking at maybe investing 3 to 6 months to put in a complicated pipeline, especially if you're sort of having to put test automation into that pipeline, develop SecOps into that pipeline, where SecOps is like security scanning. It's great. It's better if someone else, 3 months ago or a year ago has done that effort for you, and you just need to say, oh, right, that work already exists. So I can just pick it up and basically plug it into the process that I want, and job's a good one. I can just run with it. So it basically, the main thing is that it's saving you a lot of time, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel or recode everything from scratch. It's all there done for you because someone else has done it. The second one is control. Now, this will really depend on the type of organization that you're working in and the type of sector that you're in. But if you're in a sector that requires, maybe pharma, defense, or the federal, or financial services, where you require very good audit control, you require approvals, maybe you require, security approval for certain processes that are done, then if you've got the central library of DevEx services, which have been audited, approved, they've been sort of compliant to the standards that you need to be compliant to. If you're pulling from that library, then you know that auditing, that quality's already been done. And if you then make any changes to that library, you've got all of the audit trail already there. So you can basically say, if people come along and give you an audit, which they often do, then you can point to your sort of central repository of all of these services that you have and say, there you go, those are the services that we have. These are the versions that we use. This was the baseline that we did this implementation with, and these are the change requests that have gone into it. So you can prove that you've got an auditable trail of all the reviews that have been done and all the compliancy checks that have gone through. And then finally, something like delegation. So if you create a strategy that allows to create a framework that uses maybe call outs or plugins that people can then just basically plug their own process into, it gives teams the ability to sort of work within the context of your master framework, if you like, your master strategy, and they can implement what they like. So it basically empowers teams to basically take more control of the actual process that they're going to use, which if you're talking about developers and testers, is always a good thing, because they always like to sort of rule the roost. Certainly they have when the organizations I've worked for. So those are the main reasons why we actually do DevEx, and that's really the main definition of what DevEx is from a DevOps perspective. So I've been talking about DevOps and DevEx. Now, are they the same or are they different? That's a very good question. So next, what we're going to do is look at, what is DevEx versus DevOps? Are they the same or are they separate? Well, like with most of these types of questions, the answer is it depends. Yes, they are the same, and yes, they are different. So DevEx, it really depends on the perspective that you're taking. DevEx is focusing on making developers and testers' lives easy, but there are many areas that it touches that are also under the remit of sort of DevOps. So if you're looking at making your developers and testers' lives easier, that usually sort of relates to things like automation. It sort of relates to things like deployments, automating deployments, environment provisioning, which is also a lot in the DevOps realm as well. So what you'll tend to find is you'll start off with a sort of DevOps perspective, and then when you sort of have implemented what you're wanting to do for DevOps, you'll then start to look at it more from a DevEx perspective. So if we sort of looked at, what is DevEx versus DevOps, you'll sort of see that many of the areas that you're touching upon are common in their nature. So in DevEx, what you're looking to do is you're trying to provide a service catalog of services that are both related to deployment, to the developer, to environmental provisioning, to the tester, test automation. But when you look at DevOps, many of the enablers that you need to do, like CI/CD, environmental provisioning, there's a lot of commonality there, especially also if you're looking at test frameworks. If you're trying to do something which is making test automation easier, you're also going to be looking at trying to do that for DevOps as well, because you want to cut down that build cycle, you want to cut down that test cycle. So anything that helps make that deploy that use case or create that use case or run that use case easier, like maybe test automation or test data provisioning automation, you're going to want that for both DevEx and DevOps. The same for environmental provisioning. The only real thing that might be, really quite different between them is that when you start to look at frameworks, when you're looking at DevEx, you're looking at both pipeline and coding frameworks. And when you're thinking about DevOps, you're primarily thinking about pipeline frameworks. So the differences between them is like the devil is in the detail. I get the wording right. When you're looking at your DevEx service catalog, you're sort of looking to include things that might be development related. So things like golden images that you can use for providing IDE systems, golden images that have maybe debug APIs in it, tracing tools in it, things that might not be needed or relevant to DevOps environments. Those are the sorts of things that you'd focus on for your DevEx service catalog. The same for when you're doing environment automation. You know, you're looking to provision not just production-like environments, but you're also looking to provision development environments as well. So development environments with debugging APIs on it, with maybe more tracing enabled, or maybe different types of profiles. So there are sort of aspects within both the environment and the sort of provisioning that are going to be the same, but there are also some that are going to be different. There are also the cultural priorities will be different. So in DevOps, you're basically looking to try and make both the developer's life easier, the tester's life easier, and the operations life easier. And in DevEx, you're primarily focusing on primarily the developer and the tester. You're not so much focusing on the operations or the production team. You're looking at the processes that are sort of developing the software, being part of the development phases of the SDLC, the testing phases of the SDLC, not so much the production deployments or maintaining the production system, but that would be within the remit of the DevOps. And what you'll commonly find is DevOps backlogs often involve or start to evolve into DevEx backlogs. So the goals are generally the same. It's just the details and the ways you get there will be different. So the scope will be different, but the goals are the same. So what are some of the key perspective differences that I think you need to be aware of? So in DevOps, basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to focus on things like the delivery process. So you're trying to identify any bottlenecks and remove those bottlenecks. You're focusing on your CI, CD, and if you use continuous verification pipelines, you're focusing on CV pipelines as well. For environments, you're sort of focusing on trying to make your production or your environments as production-like as possible. So when you develop your software, when you test your software, the environments you're trying to put into place are as production-like as possible, with the same sort of third-party dependencies that the production environment will use, the same configuration that the production environment will use, not so much in the DevEx perspective. You're also focusing on the SRE. So SRE, site reliability engineering, you're focusing on your production system. You know, how can you observe what's going on in your production system, what signals and metrics and alerts you can set up on your production system to detect that there are issues that you need to be aware of. From a DevOps perspective, you're also definitely focusing on security. You know, security is critical throughout the entire DevOps process. And you're also, if you're looking at cloud, you're also focusing on cost controls when you implement your DevOps strategy. That's not the case from the DevEx perspective. When you're looking at from a DevEx perspective, what you're really doing is you're trying to focus on an enablement culture. So you're trying to identify and deliver services that will enable your product team to deliver quicker and smoother. So pipelines might be one of them, but they might not be the only thing. You're also trying to look at standardization. You know, if you want to share these things to across product teams, then you have to make them as standard as possible, or templateize them as much as possible. You're also trying to build a service catalog. So you're trying to put all of these enablement services into an SCM managed catalog. And if you're not familiar with the term SCM, it's basically a VM, or a version managed repository, so that you can do all the good things like your auditing, your IAM, your security control, your change control, your tagging, your baselining, all the good features that SCM usually provides you with. And then finally, you want to basically make as much of these services self-service as possible. You know, your catalog, your service catalog is full of the services, but you want to make those services such that, if someone's going to use them, that they can just basically pull those services and make use of them in an easy way. You don't want to sort of tie them into using your service catalog and make them have to write lots and lots of glue to stick their solution into your service catalog. So you try to develop your services with the idea of making them as self-service as possible, or can be plugged into self-service systems as much as possible. And that's specifically really looking at things like orchestrators, where you're basically building up a business flow or an orchestration flow that uses those services. And I'll come to that, an implementation on that in one of the up and coming sections. Okay, so I've talked a bit about what is DevOps. I've talked a bit about how it differs from, what is DevEx and how it differs from DevOps. Sorry if I use the terms intermittently. And I've also covered a bit about some of the things you need to be aware of when you're looking at trying to make use of them. So now I'm going to focus on some implementation approaches. Now, if you came to one of my presentations that I did for the BCS earlier this year, or possibly the conference last year, you may have seen these slides already. Because to be honest, when you're implementing DevEx, you can probably use a very similar approach as to when you're implementing DevOps. They have models that are very, very in sync with each other. And I found that when you're actually implementing them, you can take a DevOps approach and you can implement a DevEx backlog in pretty much the same way. So what I tend to go into a client and look at implementing DevOps or DevEx, I tend to try to sort of push either one of these three strategies. Either a central enablement team, where you've got one team or a central team that is responsible for your backlog, in this case, the DevEx backlog. And that central team is basically responsible for both the analysis and the implementation, with some assistance from functional or product teams. The other alternative approach is that you'll have a product team-led approach. And this is where the product teams basically are sort of spread out. They work in a very independent fashion, and they basically look at analyzing their own requirements. They implement the DevOps services that they need, and they may share them to a central catalog, but they will basically be looking or thinking about mostly what they need first. And the third approach, which is what I prefer, and it's usually what I say most clients should look at if they can, is a hybrid approach, where you basically have a central enablement team, which is responsible for sort of working with other teams to create a backlog, but the implementation is done by both a central team and distributed to other teams, so that they can deliver the services that they need within the time that they need them, but they do them against standard, so that everyone can then sort of share and enjoy the rest of those services as well. So when we look at some sort of suggested roadmaps, most of these are the same. They have the same sort of phases. It's just who owns them is slightly different. When you look at team ownership, basically what you would say is that each team would basically look at, what are their requirements. They may do something called a value stream mapping analysis, which I won't discuss here because it's quite an involved process, but they might look at that. They might do a maturity assessment, maybe use a CMMI model or something similar, and they'll look at that to sort of determine what type of requirements that they have. They will then use that to create a backlog. They may create an architecture, or they may also create a DevEx strategy. They will sort of say, what do we need to create? How are we going to plug it all together, and how are we going to create it? And then they'll go into, once they've got that backlog created, they'll then go into some sort of implementation phase where they'll actually create what they need. They may templaterize it, they may not, and they may share it and they may not. And then they will go into some sort of steady state or maintenance phase, where they'll basically maintain what they want, and maybe not maintain everything that they've developed, but maintain at least certainly what they're using, and then reshare those maintained or updated templates to the central repository. So I'm sure you can already see what the challenges are with that approach. The central approach, again, you're going through the same sort of phases. You've got your planning phase, where the central team basically owns the backlog. So they will basically maybe do a lot of analysis about how they can make it generic. They'll work with a lot of teams about, what sort of requirements do you have, and they will then primarily drive the implementation themselves. And I'm sure you can already see what the problem with this one is, but they will basically own the implementation, and they will basically drive most of the implementation themselves, with maybe reference to external teams or some other product teams to help them with that, but they will primarily own it and they will primarily implement it. And then when they come to a steady state, they will basically do stable maintenance releases on those services that have been developed. They may update them with sort of latest security updates. They may update them with some latest versions that have been flagged for components, or they may even put in additional features like maybe security scannings into their pipelines. You know, that really gets into what the steady state does. They maintain it and they update it. And then the hybrid approach, again, the same sort of idea. You have the planning phase, but the planning phase is both working with the teams and also working from a central perspective. So when you're looking at a hybrid approach, when you're planning it, you're sort of thinking more about, you know, how can I involve the other teams? How can I get agreement with the other teams so that if we take a generic approach, the other teams will agree to work with that. You then, when you implement it, you sort of farm out the work both to your own central team and also use a lot of the other teams. So if you say the other teams, right, well, you need to create a lot of pipelines and you need to do those ASAP. So basically, we will let you develop those pipelines. Just make sure you develop them in compliance to the standard so that when you give it back to us, you've got what you want, we've got what we want, and we can basically share it and make sure everyone else is happy with using it as well. And the steady state is basically owned by both the component teams, either the project teams, and by the central team itself. So it's a lot more of a hybrid approach. And it's preferred by me because it makes working within a distributed organization a lot easier. So you use the approach which best suits the client's culture. You know, there'll be some clients that have very, very strong and independent teams, and they basically just want to work their own way because they have their own priorities. That's fine if they want to work like that. You may have some organizations which have a very fixed strategy in mind, and they basically need everyone to comply to that strategy. You know, that's fine. Or you may have teams or organizations which have a mixture of both. So you work in a hybrid model. You know, it's all driven by the organization. You just have to be aware of what the strengths and the sort of pitfalls of those models are. So things to be aware of. If you've got a team ownership, the biggest problem is fragmentation, because each team will sort of take their own approach and do their own development. They may approach things differently, and they may tie it in specifically into the technology that they're creating. So in that case, what they deliver might be fragmented and the reuse might be a bit limited. So to get around that, you need very strong guidance as to how those deliverables are done and how they can be reused. Now, whether those teams actually make use of that guidance is really up to them, but you need to at least put in some guidance in place so that they've got at least some target to aim for. On the central approach, the biggest problem is bottlenecking. If you've got one central team that's owning both the analysis and the implementation, or doing the main set of the implementation, they can get bottlenecked. And I've seen that happen quite a lot of times, especially with things like when you're involving security teams. And if the work gets bottlenecked, then you may find that some of the project teams end up implementing their own temporary solution, in double quotes, that becomes more permanent. So then you've got two sets of migration problems, one migrating into the temporary solution and then migrating out of the temporary solution into the real solution. So if you're going to make that work, you're going to have to have very clear vision and strong leadership and strong direction to make sure that priorities are clear and that the other teams are working within those priorities. And if you had the hybrid approach, then the thing you need to focus on is making sure that you are working with those other teams, that those teams are committed to supporting you with your deliveries. And you need to make sure that those teams have standards that they can deliver their work to. So if you let them implement things, that what they give you back is reusable. So you basically have to have very, very clear guidance, very, very clear standards, and those teams that are delivering against those standards have to deliver against those standards. Otherwise, you start running into the fragmentation problem again. So a couple of approaches there for implementing DevEx or DevOps if you want. but they do have some sort of like gotchas that you've got to be aware of. So before I start jumping into implementation, let me just take a quick look at the time. No, we're not going to have time for that. So I'll push the questions to the end if that's okay. So looking at some sample implementation use cases, these are the two types of models that typically get used when you're looking at implementing DevEx within organizations. There's a hybrid team approach, which in this case, I'll show you one that we did at a banking organization. Basically, one central team owns the analysis requirements. They create general templates, which are then used and customized by the product teams, who then feed those changes back to the central catalog. And the second approach is what we call a system team approach, or an enablement team, which sort of comes from a SAFe orientated model. If you're familiar with SAFe, it's well, I'll discuss SAFe in one or two slides, but basically it's a model for working in agile using a large scale delivery sort of approach or mindset. So in the hybrid approach that we did for this banking model, and again, this model has been applicable to lots of other organizations, you get the business requirements in. Those are analyzed by product owners or other team representatives. They then generate a backlog, which goes into something like Jira or another backlog managing tool like ADO. You then use that backlog in the same way that you would with a normal backlog. It gets fed into sprint planning sessions. You get sprint teams, which might be the central team, or it might be a mixture of the other teams, helping to basically develop the outputs that you need for the DevEx services. They will have some sort of validation process within their team. So you may have a team-based CI process to just validate that the playbooks or the run books that get developed are actually work, and they deploy and they're usable. And then at the end of every sprint, what you do is you do a promotion to your service catalog, Git repository, or your service catalog repository. That will then run some sort of promotion process. Maybe it validates, or maybe it does some sort of runs it in an integrated environment. And if that runs fine, then it gets promoted. The output gets promoted to a service catalog, and that output might be a playbook, it might be a run book, it might be something like Terraform IAC code, so environment profiling. It might be Docker images. It could be anything. And then since it's in the service catalog, what you then have is you have the teams, which basically will do a request for that service. Maybe we've tended to use something called ServiceNow, which is a request orchestrator. They will raise a request in some sort of like a self-service portal. They'll put in parameters for maybe the environments that they want to deploy, the versions that they want to deploy. That will go through some sort of business process. It will bring in the run books as needed, the images as needed. It will execute it, and it will basically then just automatically deploy it onto the target system. So we've implemented this type of approach at quite a lot of companies, and it's actually worked fairly well. We may use ServiceNow, we may use some other orchestrator, but it tends to work quite well if you've got the service catalog there that you can basically build your logic on top of. For the system team approach, if you've not heard of SAFe before, basically SAFe is a scaled agile process, sort of commonly used by many organizations to deliver large-scale agile projects. So they have things called ARTs, or release teams, release trains that deliver sort of regular releases or drops at regular release cadence. And basically what you have is you have what's called a system team that is like an enablement team that supports all of the sprint teams on an agile release train. And effectively what that system team is doing, it's talking to the sprint teams all the time. It's finding out what they need to make their lives easier. And then the system team is working with those sprint teams to actually get those things delivered. So the system team in SAFe is responsible for delivering an enablement backlog, i.e. a DevEx backlog. They work with the product teams to find out what they need and then sort of code them up and deliver them to them. and then they can operate in either a central or a hybrid mode, depending upon the sort of availability of the sprint teams to help support that effort. And it's a common approach, and it's used by many organizations that use SAFe. And if you want to learn more about SAFe, then there is a link here, www.scaledagileFramework.com, and it's used in many organizations now. So we're almost coming to the end now. So key things to take away in mind for DevEx is, the first one is that when you look at DevEx, many teams will have the same sort of DevEx requirements. They will have the same requirements for creating pipelines. They will have the same requirements for creating test automation. They will have the same requirements for creating deployments or profiling environments or spinning up environments. The details might be different, but the requirements will generally be the same. You can cut down by implementing those services or implementing those requirements in a reusable fashion. You can, drastically cut down your implementation costs and time, because if someone's done it already, then you can just reuse what they've done. The ideal approach for doing this is sort of create a sort of like a standard framework that allows for delegation patterns. And if you're familiar with delegation patterns, things like call outs, events, all of those allow basically the teams to plug in the logic that they want, but they all run within a common master process. Using a service catalog allows for version and change control of the services with an audit trail, which, as I said, for many organizations in some of the stricter sort of like pharma or Fed or financial services can be quite something that they really need. And lastly, service catalogs can then be integrated with orchestrations to allow for self-service dashboards or self-service business logic. If you've got a service catalog with all of the services there that you can basically just call like an API, you can build whatever logic you like on top of them. So last slide, just a couple of key points. DevEx is there to allow other teams to share and enjoy common services. It's primarily about creating reusable services and automations that other teams can plug into. So it stops the reinventing the wheel syndrome. And if you've got lots and lots of teams, if you can cut that down for all of those teams, then obviously you're going to get all that time back and all that, and save all that investment. DevEx and DevOps have many common elements and goals, so the deliveries are very much in sync with each other. So as I said, a DevOps backlog will often morph into a DevEx backlog when you've actually developed most of your DevOps services. And finally, DevEx services can be fully integrated into an ITIL service catalog approach or held in a separate catalog, because basically they're just a catalog of services that you publish that other people can make use of, so you can control them and audit them in an ITIL fashion. So hopefully I'm within time. Any questions? Sorry, I had to push it a bit, but we were late starting, so I just want to make sure we got in time for the slot.
Okay, does anybody in the room have any questions for Tim?
Oh, sorry. I've got one question. Aren't the ops people going to feel a bit left out if they've got DevOps, which tends to emphasize dev, and DevEx emphasizes dev? Don't the ops people need something like this themselves?
They do, yes, and that's usually what you have SRE for. Site reliability engineering is where you're focusing on the SRE practices. Sorry, the ops practices.
Okay.
Now, I'd agree with you. I think everything tends to start off with the development. DevOps basically came because developers were trying to push things to operations. Operations is like test. It always seems to be thought about after the latest, greatest and things that the development environment has done. So I wouldn't be surprised if something came along in a couple of years' time that was sort of focusing on the operations team, maybe OpEx or something like that. But SRE, there's a discipline that's called SRE, which is supposed to cover that from an operations perspective and trying to push the operations sort of goals into the development experience as well.
What do you think of my comment that dev develops potential value, whereas ops delivers real value, continuing value?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. But I also think that many organizations, they sort of have a, it's almost like a bias towards the development groups, strangely enough. You know, you go and you start talking about DevOps, and it's really focusing on the development groups first, and the operations and the testing teams. You sort of need to make the point that they have to be involved in that process. So I think it's just the way organizations seem to approach this area. They seem to think about development people first, and if the operations are stable and working, and there's not really many changes going on there, and they have a good deployment process, they don't really focus so much on the ops. So yes, I'd agree with your comment. I think DevEx and DevOps tends to sort of leave the testing and the operations people a bit behind. And these are approaches, or certainly the SRE and the DevOps is like an approach to trying to bring them back into the fold.
I'd imagine there's quite a few people in operations who are pleased how similar a lot of the things you were showing there tend to look towards ITSM, and there's a lot of commonality between service management and some of the principles of DevEx there, which is really encouraging, I think.
Like service catalog.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
not only that, just the approach to doing things.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to say when you're doing a DevEx or a DevOps, you know, you start off with that VSM analysis, that value stream mapping. You know, look at the whole delivery chain. Don't just look at the development side, because the development side is only really one small part. So when you're developing your deployment services, you know, you need to think about the operation, the production environments that you're going into. You need to think about how you're going to observe those production environments. You know, what signals are you looking for? And the SRE basically has this goal of you set up observable signals called service level indicators, and you basically focus on what those service level indicators are, and everything is based on those service level indicators. So when you look at DevEx and trying to build up that catalog of services, you also want to focus really. The reason why I sort of brought out DevOps so much was, well, when you're trying to develop those DevEx services, you also really want to be focusing about those DevOps services as well. So, you know, the production deployments, the production signals, but it's not. When you start talking about DevEx to development people, they sort of thinking more about the enablement culture for what they need to do. So you need to sort of emphasize that again, that it's there for testing and operations people as well. So you need to take the SRE perspective in mind.